Like, what kind of a kid were you? What were you like when you were younger?
Well, I always say the same thing, and that is to consume films and film experiences when I was very young was on TV, and all the syndicated stations in the United States had some contract. They'd had this one had the Columbia catalog or the Warner Brothers catalog, and I would watch films all the time when I was a child on TV. They had a show on the old WOR Channel 9 in New York called $1 Million Movie. And they would play how many people here know the show $1 Million Movie?
Oh, I grew up in it. Yeah.
And they would play, the theme song was the theme song to Gone with the Wind. And they had this beautiful, beautiful black and white montage of New York. They had these beautiful images of New York. And they played Gone with the Wind. And then they had this man whose name was Ted Molly. It took me 6 months on YouTube to find out his name was Ted Molly. And when I was a child back then, they had booth announcers in all of the television stations because they had a lot of technical problems. I mean, like the tape would jam back in the 70s. And some guy would come on and say, "We're experiencing technical difficulties. We'll be back in a moment with $1 Million Movie." And they had these very velvety voices, and there were all these announcers from like radio who they put in a booth to talk to you at home when the TV jammed, which doesn't happen anymore. And there was this guy named Ted Molly who would come on, and they would announce shows. They'd say, next on $1 Million Movie, Barbara Stanwyck tells Gary Cooper where he can go in Ball of Fire. And I remember that my childhood was just listening to this and watching movies obsessively with my dad and weekends and this and that. And when I was a kid, it's obviously very different now, they'd take a movie that had been in the theater just a few years ago and put it on TV. Maybe the movie had been in the theater 5 years ago. But to see a full-length feature film from Hollywood on TV in primetime that was a popular film, everybody got so excited. It was bizarre. They'd sit there and they'd say, this blockbuster movie event on ABC, The Sound of Music. And everyone ran to the TV on Sunday night and watched The Sound of Music on TV. And it's nothing at all like it is now. And so I was addicted to watching movies from when I was like 10.
What did your dad watch?
Well, my dad would be laying there, and it would be like 11:30 at night. I've said this in many interviews before, but my dad would be laying on the couch, and my dad would have the New York Times, and the New York Times had these little pithy reviews in the television thing. So they had somebody who I would probably rate them as one of the greatest writers that ever lived. Because they wrote these like 2-line reviews of movies in the New York Times TV section. And my dad would sit there, literally he would go, gosh, that's a good one. And I'd be sitting there on the chair, he'd be like across from me, I'd go, what's a good one? What's a good one? And my dad would say, 5 Graves to Cairo with Francho Tone. That's a fantastic movie. Or a couple of weeks later, he'd say, that's a good one. I go, what's a good one? He'd say, Passage to Marseille with Humphrey Bogart and Peter Lorre. What a great movie. And sure enough, I would insinuate myself into getting my dad to let me watch a half an hour of the movie. Then he would fall asleep, and I would watch the movie till 1 o'clock in the morning, and I watched How Green Was My Valley and Witness for the Prosecution and Strangers on a Train and Sorry, Wrong Number and all these classic films. And as I always say, I watched TV when I was a kid. I'm dating, maybe there's some people old enough to remember this. When I watched TV, it was like F Troop and the Beverly Hillbillies and shows Mr. Ed and all those kinds of dopey shows. And then when you get into the Love Boat era, the Aaron Spelling era, I stopped watching TV and watched movies. And I only watched movies. So I was just, and I've also said many times in interviews that you would impersonate these films. You'd memorize every line. And I'd be like lying in bed. My mother would be taking a nap. And I'd be lying next to my mother in a bed when I was a little boy. And, Cagney and White Heat, the guy says, the guy's in the trunk of the car and he's like, open up, I can't breathe, I need some air. And, Cagney's line, whatever it was like, air? You want air? I'll give you air. Boom, boom, boom. And he'd shoot the back of the car. And when I was a kid, I would like lay in bed and like saying it as quietly as I could so my mother couldn't hear. I'd be laying there going, air? You want air? I'll give you air. Boom, boom, boom. My mother would be like, be quiet. And so you would get into miming and impersonating. Because for us, this is all there was. There was no Beta, VHS, whatever. There was no Netflix. This was it.
What do you think you saw in the movies? What do you think transfixed you?
I guess people that were really, of that period, people who really were very stylized, people who were very unique, Bogart and Gary Cooper. I think when I was young, people who were very tough, people who were very colorful, Bogart in his films just mesmerized me. He was such a signature. He would walk right up to that line where it almost seemed silly, and yet he was so authentic. He was so real and so committed, And Cagney, Gable. I remember seeing later on Gable do The Misfits, and it was interesting to see Gable of his world, Gable of the most kind of creamy and velvety and most beautiful period of filmmaking in America, trying to hold his own with these method actors, and trying to give a very raw and kind of not posing in front of the camera, which is what he was required to do basically, and for Gable to do The Misfits with Monroe and Clift and Eli Wallach, all people who were studied in the studio in the 50s. And he did a great job. I mean, you look at that movie and you go, my God, Gable was a great actor. He was a great actor. He didn't always have the chance to show it in certain films. You start to be overtaken by the emotive quality of films, and you watch people who have these powerful emotions in film. I remember never being able to get them out of my head, like the end of Meet John Doe. When they go out on the balcony and the snow is there, and they're beseeching him, Stanwyck is beseeching him not to give up. And that wonderful scene. I loved watching people who were these very skilled. I love actors who could go both ways, and no one more so than James Mason. I thought that Mason was this incredibly gifted actor. So when you watch him in A Star Is Born, and he plays this horrible guy. The Norman Maine character is very selfish, and some of it is because of alcoholism, obviously. But then I remember him as the villain in The Verdict with Paul Newman. I remember what a horrible villain. He was a great villain because he was so powerful intellectually, and his acting was so. But this is a guy who just the muscularity of his acting, and that scene where Lindsay Krause was the nurse, if you know the film, obviously, and she forges the document. And then she breaks down on the stand and says, "Who are these men? I wanted to be a nurse." Every time I watch that scene, I sob, I cry that this woman's ambitions are crushed in all the malice and the greed of these men in this case. And I've been starting to become overtaken by all that, Brando, obviously, saying, whatever you do, don't leave him here. When his brother's dead, and his brother who betrayed him, and his brother who did all these horrible things, and his brother who was a handmaiden of all these horrible people, and yet Brando is overcome by the death of Steiger in that scene in the alleyway when he's on the hook. "I'm going to take it out on their skulls," he says. And you just watch that movie over and over again because of the power of it. And I just remember becoming addicted to that too.
I'm really interested in how well you remember, how emotionally you remember this. Obviously, it meant a lot to you. Like, was your family expressive emotionally? Was this a place where you found a place to put your
Becoming
emotions?
a bit psychoanalytic here for my taste, if I may say so. Let's confine ourselves to my mimicry, if you don't mind.
Just following the thread here.
No, but I mean, my dad loved movies, and my parents didn't have any money. My dad was a school teacher with 6 kids. He didn't have any money. To go to Broadway was like, we go on a school trip and go see a Broadway show, and that was a big deal. And to go to the movies in the movie theater was a big deal, And so you watched a lot of these movies on TV. And I guess at the same time, all this is going on, and I never had a moment of thinking I would do that for a living. Never. I never sat there and go, I'm coming to Hollywood. My ex-wife was someone who grew up laying on a floor in Athens, Georgia, watching TV and watching, Tab Hunter movies, and sitting there going, oh, California. God, I've got to go to California. That looks so exciting. She was from Georgia, and she talked about dreaming. A dream of hers was to be in that business and to find a place in that business. I never had that dream, ever, ever. And when I got into the movie business, I've always felt like a stranger in a strange land.
What did you think you would be?
I thought I'd be serving popcorn here at the TIFF Film Festival. I wanted to go to law school and be a lawyer. Probably go into politics was a dream of mine. Help people, public service, that kind of thing. And I went into acting school, and I said, well, I'll give it a year. Once I finished NYU or did that year at NYU, I said, I'll give it a year and getting a job. And I got a job, and I just lit one off the other, and I just kept working. And I did daytime TV, nighttime TV, small parts of movies, big parts of movies. I did Red October, and everything changed for me a lot in terms of the Hollywood, ladder, if you will. And but I really have a perspective now. I really feel now at my life, I really have a perspective that's my best perspective. And I'm almost 60. I'm 58 years old. So I really kind of see, when I do a movie now, I'm very, it's a very unique time for me. When I was here today, I went to CBC and interviewed Gordon Lightfoot. And to talk to him about his process of when he performs, how he really, there's so much sitting with his guitar and tuning his guitar and thinking about what he's going to do, and the band kind of gets into this thing. His artistry is his preparation. The moment you step up to that microphone and you start to play, if you could read my mind, all the work has to come before, and now every time I do a movie, I really, like I'm going to do a movie, I think, in October, and I think about it all the time, like how I'm going to play it, what I'm going to do, and you start the preparation early on, and that excites me.